Beliefs about inherent racial superiority have led to horrific acts of genocide, enslavement, and oppression throughout history. In this context, we'll be specifically discussing one such belief, namely white supremacy, the belief that people of European descent are inherently superior to others, that black people could be enslaved and dehumanized, and that race determined one's social, moral, and intellectual capacity. This belief in white supremacy was so pervasive that it led to the enslavement of millions of black people, their brutal treatment, the tearing apart of families, and enduring racial inequality, bias, and structural racism even after chattel slavery was formally abolished. So let's take a look at its origins and drivers, its manifestations and consequences. Well, the belief in white supremacy has its origins in European colonialism and the economic logic of plantation agriculture, which developed in the Americas. The high mortality rates among indigenous populations in the Americas due to European diseases combined with the high profits to be made from cash crops like tobacco, cotton, and sugar led to the transatlantic slave trade. The forced migration of Africans across the Atlantic to work on plantations in the Americas. The horrific human cost of this trade was justified through pseudoscientific ideas of racial hierarchy and the notion of the white man as burden, which claimed that Europeans had a duty to uplift and supposedly inferior non-white populations. Once in the Americas, legal, religious, and social systems quickly developed that reinforced the unequal status of Africans and their descendants, solidifying the belief in white supremacy. In the United States, this took the form of chattel slavery, where enslaved people were legally considered property with no rights or freedoms. They were bought, sold, and inherited like any other asset. Children born to enslaved parents were also considered property, ensuring the continuation of slavery across generations. This chattel slavery was then buttressed by a host of dehumanizing stereotypes, one of which was the mammy stereotype, which depicted black female slaves as happy, long-suffering caregivers who were devoted to their white employers. These stereotypes served to justify the horrors of slavery by portraying enslaved people as less than human, as simple-minded creatures who didn't feel pain and whose suffering didn't matter. To enforce this racial hierarchy, Wikipedia laws and practices known as slave codes were implemented. These laws restricted the movement of enslaved people, prohibited them from gathering in large numbers, and denied them access to education. After slavery was officially abolished in the United States in 1865, these systems of racial control didn't disappear. Instead, they evolved into various forms of segregation and Jim Crow laws that enforced a racial hierarchy and maintained white supremacy. Segregation enforced the separation of races, often through the use of violence and intimidation. Jim Crow laws were a set of state and local laws enacted in the southern and some border states of the U.S. between 1890 and the mid-1960s. These laws were designed to disenfranchise and segregate African Americans. They limited access to public facilities, mandated racial segregation in public spaces like buses and trains, and even dictated where African Americans could live. But the consequences of this belief in white supremacy were even more dire. It led to the enslavement of millions of Africans and their descendants, the brutal and inhumane treatment of an entire race, the tearing apart of families when parents were sold away from their children and communities, and it resulted in the perpetuation of racial inequality, bias, and systemic racism that continues to have detrimental effects even after slavery and Jim Crow were abolished. And while overt forms of racism and discrimination based on this belief have been widely condemned and in many places made illegal, the belief in white supremacy hasn't disappeared. It festers in the hearts and minds of some and occasionally explodes into horrific acts of hate and violence. More insidiously, though, it can also manifest in implicit bias and everyday attitudes and behaviors that perpetuate racial inequality. Unchecked, these biases can lead to the marginalization and mistreatment of minority groups, preventing them from fully participating in society and achieving their potential. Therefore, it is crucial that we continue to challenge and dismantle these beliefs, not just for the sake of marginalized communities, but for the sake of all of humanity, because a world where some believe themselves to be superior to others, based solely on the color of their skin, is a world that is unjust, immoral, and unsustainable. And we must all work towards creating a world where everyone, regardless of race, is valued, respected, and treated with dignity. I hope you found this video helpful. If you want to learn more about white supremacy and its origins, you might also want to check out additional resources. Thanks for watching.